When the Luftwaffe began its sustained bombing campaign against Britain in September 1940, German intelligence officers had compiled what they believed to be comprehensive target lists. Every major railway junction, every marshalling yard, every significant depot appeared on maps spread across planning tables in occupied France. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium was confident they understood Britain's transportation infrastructure completely. They were catastrophically wrong. What German reconnaissance failed to detect, what their intelligence networks never penetrated, and what their bombers never successfully targeted was a railway system that technically didn't exist. Not on any public map, not in any official railway timetable, and certainly not in any documents that might fall into enemy hands. This was Britain's ghost network. A sprawling web of strategic railways, hidden sidings, and camouflage depots that kept the island's military machine functioning even as conventional rail infrastructure burned. The system's origins traced back to 1936, long before most Britons seriously contemplated another war with Germany. The Air Ministry, working with military planners who remembered the chaos of World War I logistics, commissioned a classified study. The question was simple and terrifying. What happens to our military capability if the railways stop working? Britain's army depended entirely on rail transport for strategic movement. Tanks couldn't drive themselves 300 miles from factories to ports. Artillery pieces, ammunition, fuel, food, everything the military needed moved by train. If Germany gained air superiority and systematically destroyed the rail network, Britain's ability to defend itself would collapse within weeks. The study's conclusions, delivered in April 1937, made for grim reading. Britain's railway system was magnificently efficient and utterly vulnerable. The major lines all converged on obvious choke points. London alone had 15 main stations, each a target that couldn't be missed by even moderately competent bombardiers. Destroy the junctions at Crewe, Rugby, York and Doncaster, and you'd effectively cut Britain in half. The entire system was a target-rich environment where every important facility was visible from the air and impossible to defend comprehensively. The solution proposed was radical: build a parallel system, not to replace the civilian railways, but to shadow them. Create a network of military-only lines connecting factories to depots, depots to ports, and training areas to embarkation points. Make these lines difficult to spot from the air, impossible to find on captured documents, and redundant enough that destroying one section wouldn't cripple the whole system. The proposal landed on desks in Whitehall, where practical men did practical mathematics. The cost would be enormous. The construction timeline would take years. The whole project might prove unnecessary if war never came. They approved it. Anyway, in June 1937, under provisions so classified that even most members of Parliament weren't briefed, construction began on what would eventually be called the Strategic Reserve Railway System. The name itself was deliberately bland, bureaucratic camouflage for one of the war's most successful deception operations. The first phase focused on connecting Royal Ordnance factories to existing main lines via routes that avoided obvious geographical features. Engineers surveyed routes through forests, alongside canals hidden by tree cover, and through industrial areas where additional rail spurs wouldn't look suspicious. The Midlands became the network's heart. Factories around Birmingham, Coventry and Nottingham produced the bulk of Britain's tanks, artillery and ammunition. The SRRS connected these facilities with lines that meandered deliberately, avoiding straight routes that might show up clearly on aerial photographs. A conventional railway engineer would have been horrified by the inefficiency. Strategic railways took the long way around hills instead of cutting through them. They paralleled existing roads at odd angles. They disappeared into what looked like warehouse districts, but were actually elaborate camouflage structures hiding marshalling yards. Camouflage became an obsession. The Air Ministry hired civilian artists, set designers from London theatres, and landscape architects to make railways invisible. Their techniques ranged from simple to ingeniously complex. The simplest involved painting. Rails and sleepers got coated with matte pigments that matched local soil colours. Nothing could eliminate the linear feature entirely, but reducing contrast made photo interpretation far more difficult. More elaborate camouflage used netting suspended on poles above rail lines, creating false canopies that from above looked like continuous forest or agricultural land. These installations required constant maintenance. Trees had to be woven into the netting to match seasonal changes. When snow fell, teams would spread white sheeting over the nets within hours. German photo analysts looking at reconnaissance images saw what appeared to be unbroken woodland, never suspecting that beneath the canopy trains moved every night. The most sophisticated deception involved building fake structures next to real ones. A strategic depot might sit adjacent to what appeared to be a brick factory, complete with smokestacks that occasionally produced real smoke. The brick factory was entirely hollow, a theatrical set constructed to draw attention away from the nondescript buildings where ammunition was actually stored. Luftwaffe bombers attacking the obvious target would devastate an empty shell, while the real facility, 200 yards away, and looking like agricultural storage, remained untouched. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the SRRS comprised roughly 400 miles of track. Not an impressive figure compared to Britain's 20,000 miles of conventional railways, but those 400 miles connected every critical node in the military supply chain. More importantly, they'd been built with operational security that bordered on paranoia. Construction crews worked in isolated sections, never seeing the full route. Railway workers assigned to strategic lines signed the Official Secrets Act and faced blunt warnings about the consequences of loose talk. Even the track itself had been sourced carefully. Rails came from multiple suppliers to avoid creating a paper trail. Sleepers were mixed batches of wood and concrete to prevent distinctive patterns from being spotted. The system's first real test came not from German bombs, but from British chaos. In September 1939, the military's mobilization plan called for moving 2 infantry divisions from Yorkshire to Southampton for embarkation to France. The conventional route via London would have worked, but Whitehall was nervous about congestion. Someone suggested using the strategic network. The movement went ahead and it was a disaster. Trains got lost because signalmen weren't familiar with the new routes. A locomotive broke down on a stretch where no maintenance facilities existed. One train full of soldiers spent 6 hours stationary in a camouflage siding while officers tried to figure out where they actually were. The operation that should have taken 12 hours stretched to 3 days. The army was furious. Recriminations flew. Some officers argued the whole strategic railway concept was an expensive boondoggle that complicated logistics instead of simplifying them. The criticism had merit. A secret railway network is only useful if people know how to use it, and operational security had been so tight that even many senior officers didn't know it existed until they tried to use it. The solution was compromise. A cadre of specially trained railway operating staff, mostly drawn from civilian railway companies, received full briefings on the SRRS. These men would supervise all military movements on strategic lines, ensuring trains didn't vanish into the camouflaged labyrinth. The phony war period from September 1939 to April 1940 gave the system time to shake down. Military traffic increased steadily as the British Expeditionary Force deployed to France and new divisions formed at training areas across England. The strategic railways handled secondary routes, moving supplies and equipment that didn't require the speed of main line expresses. Gradually, officers learned which routes existed and when to use them. The system's value remained theoretical, though. Britain wasn't being bombed yet. the elaborate camouflage sat unmolested under empty skies. Dunkirk changed everything. Between May the 26th and June the 4th, 1940, over 338,000 British and Allied troops evacuated from France through the port whose name would become synonymous with desperate retreats. They arrived in England with essentially nothing. The BEF had left behind its tanks, its artillery, its trucks, everything that couldn't fit on the rescue ships. Britain's army came home, but Britain's army's equipment was scattered across French beaches or sitting abandoned in Belgian fields. The industrial response was frantic. Factories that had been producing equipment at peacetime rates suddenly needed to replace an entire army's worth of material. Tank production doubled, then tripled. Ammunition factories ran 3 shifts. The strategic problem was getting this material to where the army could use it. Southern England, where invasion seemed imminent, needed to be fortified immediately. But moving massive quantities of military equipment south meant running trains through the most vulnerable parts of Britain's railway network. The Luftwaffe provided urgent motivation. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940, with German fighters and bombers attacking Channel convoys and coastal targets. By August, the target list had expanded to include RAF airfields. In early September, frustrated by their failure to destroy fighter command, the Germans shifted focus to London. The Blitz had begun, and with it came sustained attacks on British infrastructure. Railway stations, goods yards, and junction points burned. On the night of September 7, 1940, German bombers hit London's docklands. The fires could be seen from 50 miles away. St. Catherine Docks, Surrey commercial docks, and the railways serving them were devastated. Over the following weeks, the pattern became grimly predictable. German bombers would appear after dark, guided by rivers that reflected moonlight. They'd find cities by the glow of previous fires. They'd drop high explosive and incendiaries on anything that looked important. Railway installations, with their distinctive patterns of parallel lines converging on large buildings, were impossible to miss. Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Coventry all took repeated hits. The damage to conventional rail infrastructure was staggering. By the end of 1940, over 9,000 separate incidents had affected Britain's railways. Bridges collapsed, stations burned, tracks twisted by explosions lay waiting for repair crews who worked under threat of renewed attack. This was exactly the scenario the strategic network had been designed to address. While repair crews struggled to restore conventional lines, military traffic shifted to the hidden system. A tank factory in Birmingham that would normally ship via the London, Midland and Scottish Railway main line instead routed its products onto an SRRS branch that ran southeast through Warwickshire. The trains travelled at night, never exceeding 30 miles per hour, crawling through the darkness under camouflage nets. From above, even if German aircraft had been directly overhead, there was nothing to see, just shadows and indistinct terrain. The Germans knew something was wrong. Their intelligence analysts looked at damage assessments from railway bombing raids and compared them to the British military's continued operational tempo. The math didn't add up. Luftwaffe bombers had hit every major marshalling yard in southern England. Reconnaissance photos showed destroyed buildings, cratered tracks, and burned-out locomotives. Yet British Army units continued to move. Equipment continued to reach ports. The supply chain hadn't collapsed. Something was sustaining British logistics, and German intelligence couldn't identify what. Several theories circulated through Abwehr offices. Some analysts suggested the British were using roads far more than intelligence had estimated. This didn't withstand scrutiny because road movement of heavy equipment was slow, inefficient, and conspicuous. German reconnaissance would have spotted convoys of tank transporters. Others proposed that British railways simply repaired damage faster than Germany credited. This was partly true. British railway workers performed miracles of improvisation, but their efforts alone couldn't explain the discrepancy. The closest anyone came to the truth was a Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from December 1940. An analyst noted that reconnaissance photos of certain industrial areas showed what might be rail spurs serving factories, but the spurs didn't connect to any mapped railway line. The analyst theorized these might be internal factory tramways. The report was filed and forgotten. The idea that Britain had constructed hundreds of miles of hidden strategic railways simply seemed too elaborate, too expensive, and too effectively concealed to be credible. Meanwhile, the SRRS was proving its worth nightly. A typical operation might look like this. On the evening of November 18, 1940, a train of 15 wagons loaded with 25-pounder artillery pieces departed from a Royal Ordnance factory near Nottingham. Instead of heading to the nearby main line, it turned onto an SRRS branch that ran east, paralleling but not touching the civilian network. The route took it through a landscape that barely seemed capable of supporting a railway. The line ran through the Sherwood Forest area, where centuries-old oaks provided natural concealment. It skirted villages, always staying just out of sight behind tree lines or embankments. At several points, the train passed under camouflage structures built to look from above like agricultural barns. These barns were actually bridging points where the strategic line passed over or under conventional roads. Anyone driving past would see what appeared to be a normal farm building. Above, German reconnaissance aircraft photographing the road network saw nothing suspicious. The train continued south, through Leicestershire, into Northamptonshire, moving through a night made brilliant by searchlights sweeping for German bombers that never came close enough to spot the slow-moving freight below. By dawn on November the 19th, the train had reached a strategic depot near Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. The depot itself was a masterwork of camouflage. What appeared from above to be a series of agricultural buildings surrounding a country estate was actually a major ammunition and artillery storage facility. The buildings had real farming equipment visible in yards, tractors that occasionally moved to maintain the illusion. But inside the barns were stacks of artillery shells. Inside the storage sheds were field guns, and beneath what looked like hayricks were fuel dumps. The artillery pieces were unloaded into storage, catalogued by staff who worked entirely indoors to avoid being seen from above, and within 48 hours, they'd be loaded onto another train for movement to an army unit forming in Kent. The entire operation, from factory to frontline unit, never touched a mainline railway. German intelligence, studying their maps of British rail networks, had no way of tracking this movement because on their maps the route didn't exist. The system's invisibility relied on obsessive attention to detail. Every element of the strategic railways that might show up in aerial photography received treatment. Locomotive sheds were built to look like industrial warehouses. Turntables, which create distinctive circular patterns, were eliminated entirely from strategic depots. Trains used push-pull configurations to avoid needing to turn around. Even the locomotives themselves were camouflaged, painted in disruptive patterns that broke up their outline when seen from above. Smoke discipline was absolute. Strategic line locomotives burned Welsh anthracite, a coal that produced minimal smoke compared to the bituminous coal most railways used. Crews received strict instructions about when they could build up steam. In designated areas under heavy camouflage, smoke didn't matter. In exposed sections, locomotives had to be at operating pressure before entering and couldn't release steam pressure until they'd reached cover again. This made operations slower and more complex, but it maintained invisibility. The human cost of maintaining this secrecy was substantial. Railway workers on the strategic network understood they were targets if discovered. Unlike civilian railway workers, who could seek shelter during air raids, SRRS personnel often had to keep trains moving through attacks. If a train loaded with ammunition stopped under a camouflage net during an air raid, it had to stay there, crew and all, until the all clear sounded. The alternative, moving and potentially being spotted, risked compromising the entire system. Several close calls tested nerves. On the night of November 14, 1940, during the devastating raid on Coventry, a strategic line train loaded with aircraft engines was stopped at a camouflaged siding less than 2 miles from the city centre. The crew watched the city burn. Bombs fell close enough that the train rocked from blast waves, but orders were absolute. Don't move, don't show lights, maintain the camouflage. The crew stayed in their positions for 7 hours while Coventry was destroyed around them. When dawn came and they could finally move, they found the conventional railway line into Coventry completely severed. The strategic line, invisible under its netting, was untouched. By early 1941, the SRRS was handling roughly 40% of all military railway traffic in England. This wasn't publicised. Security remained paramount. But internally, military logisticians understood they'd found a solution to the vulnerability that had terrified them in 1937. The Germans could destroy every conventional railway in Britain, and it wouldn't cripple military logistics. The ghost network would keep functioning. The system's capacity expanded through 1941. New spurs connected to Royal Ordnance factories being built in Scotland. The network reached westward into Wales, where munitions facilities in more remote areas needed connection to the supply chain. Each new section brought the same challenges: surveying routes that avoided obvious features, constructing lines that blended with terrain, training crews in the peculiar demands of operating invisible railways. German intelligence continued to puzzle over British logistics. An Abwehr report from May 1941 noted with frustration that British military movements seemed to occur without corresponding railway traffic on known lines. The report suggested either the British had developed some revolutionary motor transport capability, or they were using railways that German intelligence hadn't identified. The second possibility was dismissed as unlikely. How could an entire railway network exist without being detected? The answer lay in operational discipline that never relaxed. Every person who worked on the SRRS understood that a single photograph showing a hidden line could unravel years of construction and billions of pounds of investment. Worse, it could give the Luftwaffe a target list that would cripple British military logistics. The stakes ensured compliance with security protocols that might otherwise have seemed absurdly paranoid. Photography was forbidden. Workers couldn't take personal cameras anywhere near strategic lines. Railway police, working under military authority, had powers to confiscate any camera found in restricted zones. Even official documentation was minimized. Track diagrams existed, but they were classified at the highest level. Signalmen learned routes through practical experience, not by studying maps they might lose or that might be captured. The Germans did eventually photograph parts of the system, though they never understood what they were seeing. Reconnaissance aircraft flying at high altitude sometimes captured images of camouflaged sections during the brief moments when netting was being adjusted or when winter snow made certain features more visible. These images confused photo interpreters. They'd see what looked like possible railway tracks, but the tracks didn't connect to anything on their maps. Without context, the interpreters usually concluded they were seeing natural features, shadows, or photographic artifacts. One particularly close call came in August 1941. A German reconnaissance aircraft, flying at unusually low altitude after getting separated from its formation, passed directly over a strategic depot in Wiltshire at the exact moment a train was being loaded. The crew spotted the train and photographed it. The resulting image clearly showed a locomotive, multiple wagons, and what were obviously military supplies being loaded. The photograph reached intelligence analysts who immediately recognized its significance. For 3 weeks, the SRRS staff waited for German bombing raids targeting that depot. Security was already considering whether the entire section of network near the compromised depot needed to be abandoned. Then captured documents from a German aircraft shot down over the channel revealed what had happened. The reconnaissance crew's report had been filed incorrectly. The photograph had been catalogued as showing a conventional railway depot, and the location had been misidentified due to navigation errors. The Germans believed they'd photographed a facility near Southampton when they'd actually been over a location 40 miles inland. They bombed what they thought was the target, hit empty fields, and never realized their mistake. The incident prompted changes. Camouflage netting over loading areas was doubled. Procedures were implemented to ensure no train remained stationary in partially covered positions during daylight hours. The system had survived discovery through enemy error, but relying on enemy errors was no basis for security. Protocols tightened further. By 1942, the nature of the war in Britain had changed. The Blitz had ended it as Germany redirected its air power to support the invasion of the Soviet Union. British skies became quieter, though the threat of renewed bombing always remained. The strategic railway network's role evolved. Instead of providing redundancy for damaged conventional lines, it increasingly became the primary means of moving certain categories of materiel. Anything classified as strategically sensitive, particularly new weapon systems, moved exclusively on SRRS routes. When the first Churchill tanks emerged from production, they traveled to testing grounds and training areas via strategic lines. When radar equipment, still highly classified, needed transport from factories to coastal installations, the SRRS provided secure movement. The system had become not just a backup network, but the preferred method for anything the British military wanted to keep hidden from German intelligence. The build-up to D-Day in 1943 and 1944 put unprecedented demands on the network. Southern England became a massive military depot as men and equipment concentrated for the invasion of France. Moving this material without revealing the invasion's scale and location required elaborate deception. The SRRS played a crucial role. Equipment destined for the actual invasion ports moved on strategic lines, while decoy traffic on conventional railways suggested different embarkation points. German intelligence, watching conventional railway movements through aerial reconnaissance and agent reports, concluded the invasion would likely target the Pas-de-Calais region. This matched nicely with railway traffic they could observe. What they couldn't see was the massive flow of material moving along hidden routes to ports in Hampshire and Dorset. Tanks travelled under camouflage nets. Artillery pieces moved in trains that never appeared on any German tracking of British rail movements. The deception held until Allied troops were wading ashore on Normandy beaches. Post-invasion, the strategic network's importance declined. With Allied air superiority over Britain firmly established, the risk of German bombing had effectively vanished. The elaborate camouflage remained in place through habit and continued security concerns, but operational tempo on strategic lines decreased. Conventional railways could handle most traffic without fear of interruption. The system's existence remained classified long after the war ended. British military planners, looking ahead to potential Cold War scenarios, saw value in maintaining hidden transportation infrastructure. The camouflage was quietly removed, but the tracks remained. Many strategic lines were eventually connected to the conventional network, becoming branch lines serving industrial areas. Others were abandoned, the rails pulled up, the rights of way returned to agriculture or forestry. Declassification came in stages through the 1970s and 1980s. Even then, many details remained protected. Complete maps of the SRRS have never been publicly released. Some sections that still serve military facilities remain classified. But enough information emerged to reveal the scope of what had been accomplished. The statistics are remarkable. Between 1940 and 1945, the strategic railway network moved over 2 million tons of military materiel. It operated roughly 15,000 individual train movements without a single instance of confirmed detection by German intelligence. The construction cost, adjusted for inflation, would exceed $2 billion in modern terms. The operational cost, including camouflage maintenance, specialized training, and inefficiency from using longer routes, added perhaps 20% to Britain's wartime railway expenses. Was it worth it? The question invites counterfactuals that can't be definitively answered. Britain's conventional railways, despite taking thousands of tons of German bombs, never completely ceased functioning. Repair crews performed miracles. Alternative routings kept traffic moving. Would Britain have lost the war without the strategic network? Almost certainly not. The island was never close to logistical collapse. But the SRRS provided something beyond physical transportation capacity. It provided certainty. Military. Planners could count on being able to move critical material regardless of what the Luftwaffe did. That certainty enabled decisions that might otherwise have been too risky. Equipment could be concentrated where needed without fear that a single lucky German bomb on a railway junction would strand it. New weapons could be transported without alerting German intelligence to their existence. The psychological value of knowing logistics wouldn't fail might have been more important than the tons of material actually moved. The system also represented a peculiarly British approach to problems. Rather than defending existing infrastructure, which is difficult and expensive, they built new infrastructure designed from the start to be invisible. Rather than accepting risk, they spent enormous sums to eliminate it. The project showed both the strength and weakness of British military planning. The strength, willingness to think unconventionally and invest in unglamorous capabilities that might never be needed. The weakness, a tendency toward elaborate technical solutions when simpler approaches might have sufficed. German military historians, examining the SRRS after details emerged, expressed grudging admiration mixed with frustration. The system represented exactly the kind of comprehensive deception that Allied intelligence had excelled at throughout the war. One German officer, asked about the strategic railways in a 1980s interview, remarked that it exemplified why Germany lost. The British could spend billions on a railway network that might never be used, just to have it available if needed. Germany, economically strained from the war's beginning, could never afford such hedging. Every resource had to be deployed for immediate effect. The legacy of the SRRS extends beyond its operational history. It influenced post-war thinking about infrastructure vulnerability. Modern military logistics planning assumes that obvious facilities will be targeted and plans accordingly. The idea of distributed, redundant, camouflaged infrastructure became standard. Soviet strategic planning during the Cold War incorporated extensive hidden transportation networks. NATO constructed concealed fuel pipelines, ammunition depots, and communications lines based partly on lessons learned from the British strategic railways. For the railway workers who spent years operating trains that officially didn't exist, the experience was peculiar and often frustrating. They couldn't tell families where they worked. They couldn't take pride in achievements that had to remain secret. Some carried their silence to graves, having signed Official Secrets Act documents that never released them from confidentiality. Others, after declassification, spoke of the strange isolation of working on phantom railways, moving ghost trains through a hidden world that existed alongside civilian Britain but never touched it. The few physical remnants that survive are unremarkable, an overgrown embankment that seems oddly well-engineered for a farm track, a cutting through a forest that's too straight to be natural but too far from any mapped railway to make sense, concrete plinths in fields that once supported camouflage netting poles. To anyone who doesn't know what they're looking at, these fragments mean nothing. They're just minor oddities in the British landscape, curiosities without context. But for the historians who've pieced together the SRRS story from declassified documents, from interviews with elderly veterans who finally could talk, from aerial photographs examined with modern technology that reveals what 1940s photo interpreters missed, these fragments represent something extraordinary. They're evidence of a secret kept so well that the enemy never understood what they were missing. They're proof that Britain ran a parallel railway network through the entire war, moving the material that kept the military functioning, and did it all without Hitler ever knowing where to aim his bombs. The ultimate measure of the SRRS's success is simple. The Germans never destroyed it because they never found it. In warfare, the target you can't identify is the target you can't kill. Britain built railways that couldn't be identified, and those invisible tracks kept rolling through every night of the Blitz, through every crisis, through every moment when conventional wisdom said rail transport was too vulnerable to rely upon. The trains ran in darkness, under nets, through camouflaged landscapes, and they ran until the war was won. Hitler's bombers never found them, because the greatest deception isn't making your enemy see something that isn't there. It's making them not see something that is.